More and more often, ophthalmology practices use AI for content production that involves patient education copywriting. What they don't realize is that the copy looks good and seems plausible, but it needs more than just simple prompts like, write me a blog post on LASIK for millennials. Because if they use AI this way, they are outsourcing authorship of patient education, possibly without knowing the risks that it may introduce if done without rigor. Today's conversation isn't about ads, funnels, or conversion rates. It's about what patients are taught about procedures, conditions, and treatments, and how AI has entered your conversation with patients. If you've ever used AI-generated content without knowing what we're talking about next, it probably sounded right to you, but as you'll learn, that might not be good enough, and this episode is for you. Welcome to AI Ophthalmology Marketing Lab Talk, Episode 1, Patient Education Armageddon. This is Peter J. Polack, MD, and with me is Becky Smith, and we're co-founders of Visionary Marketing Lab. So, Becky, when we say patient education Armageddon, what are we actually talking about? And just as importantly, what are we not talking about?
Hey, Peter, and hi, everybody. Is and is not is probably the context I'm going to do right here real quick. It is not a general marketing type discussion about patient education marketing assets in general. It's not about using funnels, stuff like that. This is about the copy creation of the education asset and what the patients are actually taught to believe before they make a medical decision or an ophthalmic decision. So the concern is the authorship, often invisible authorship.
So, what we're not talking about is how ophthalmology is actually marketed, but we're talking about how the patients are being educated about the ophthalmology or the procedures.
Correct.
Okay, so let's walk through a situation where a typical practice thinks that they're doing the right thing, but this problem actually shows up.
Well, it's pretty stealthy. Usually they're trying to be productive. So they want AI to give them copy that could be used in many channels like email and blog posts, newsletters, maybe Instagram reel scripts or something like that. And they or their agency use AI. And then they do a prompt. It looks very good. It's got the audience, it's got the call to action, it's got the typical things that you would think patient education would want to have in it about LASIK for millennials. Give me a 3-step carousel about the benefits of considering it, things like that. So it feels professional, it feels specific. It's got all the things that it should have.
So there's nothing malicious about this process. I mean, the agency isn't trying to do anything. The software, the AI isn't actually malicious. So where's the problem here?
Well, the prompt feels good, but the prompt is controlling the format. But the truth of what is the educational piece is actually up to AI. And because you don't control the sources that it might use, the knowledge base in general, the training data is what it's called, what gets omitted, you don't know. What's softened or maybe averaged across several data points, you don't know.
So the output of the AI is specific. So it sounds good. We're going to be using this term a lot, rigorous. It feels rigorous, but it's not. It's just specific.
The prompt feels rigorous.
Okay, so let's talk about where does this actually go wrong? Because again, as I said before, no one is, we hope, nobody's trying to be malicious here. So where do things actually go wrong here?
Well, the problem is what I would call unknowing delegation. And the mechanism is something called recursive. That's how it becomes unknown because it's recursively delegated to multiple entities without any oversight or rigor about where is it now and what's going on. So there's moving parts to this. So think about the term recursive delegation as the mechanism for introducing this risk.
Okay, so let's go a little deeper into that. Describe exactly what this recursive delegation is and how it happens.
Well, there's scenario A, where the marketing director or the staff delegates to AI to generate the copy. They take it and they run with it. Scenario B, they delegate to an agency, and the agency uses AI and they take the ball and send it right back to the practice, and the practice runs with it. And then thirdly, the agency delegates to a freelancer who might be a specialist in ophthalmology subspecialty. So that freelancer uses AI, hands it to the agency, hands it to the practice, and everybody runs with it.
And everybody thinks, because we had some experts involved in the workflow, that the work product is accurate. There's a famous story now of Deloitte, the consulting firm that used AI for some reports. One was for the Australian government, another one is for the Canadian government. And there were so many mistakes. The reports were riddled with inaccuracies that they actually had to refund their fee. So, what we're talking about here is that it's not just that the work was delegated, but the delegation itself was delegated.
Yeah, that was about a $400,000
Yeah.
delegation right there. And that what was outsourced was the decision making around what was true and what should be faithfully represented as the practice's statement about that.
Okay. So, if a practice is going to be using an agency or somebody delegating for them to produce this content, and in all likelihood, AI is going to be used as part of the workflow. What are some of the questions that the practice should be asking to protect itself?
Well, they should ask some due diligence questions about methodology. We've got an asset for you to review and use at your leisure. The other thing is that themselves, if they're doing their own copywriting, they need to have an approach that understands when some of these, they're not really error conditions that are glaring, but these sneaky little problems begin to emerge in the copy that's being produced during a session. So it's either the agency's doing it. So here's a tool that maybe you could consider using to at least refine that process to so that the partners and everybody else understands. And then just internally, there is things you need to know about so you can recognize them when the copy that you're getting may be close but no cigar.
Okay, so again, most practices are assuming that there's expertise somewhere in this workflow, but they're not verifying where. So let's talk about why this is happening, because most AI generated patient education actually looks good. We alluded to that earlier. So, how is this slipping past people?
Well, think about what you get when you write a prompt asking for patient education, anything. You'll tell it, let's say, based on the length of the article or the topic, it will be clean in that sense, could be calm or reassuring, in terms of the tone. The language doesn't jar the sensibilities. It's nothing obviously false. There are things that are not dialed in properly sometimes, but it's not a glaring, like, that's just preposterous kind of thing. And the danger is that it's plausible.
Okay, so again, to reiterate, the most dangerous thing is not that it's wrong necessarily, but that it's plausible, or it doesn't sound wrong, but it sounds plausible. So let's talk about some other aspects of this content production. One is the concept of drift. Explain what drift is.
Well, drift, in a nutshell, is slow cumulative change as the conversation continues. So, as longer and longer conversations are held, because let's say you're trying to dial in your message. You want a tight, bright message, and AI is not really getting it. So you're asking it different ways for this output that you're really seeking. And some of this is the ability of the prompt that you start with to get to the point quickly and have it return a result set that is what you were seeking. Like, you gave me what I asked for, but it wasn't what I wanted. So it's incremental. Drift is close enough. Looks good, reads good, but the language may soften or the boundaries between the ideas seem to blur somewhat. And it's not going to ring an alarm bell, really. It's just over time, it doesn't reflect the original intent or even what you thought was a good idea, but you wanted to polish it somewhat.
And again, as we've been sort of been talking about, when there are these things that are not so obvious, that's when they become more dangerous. So now there's another concept known as conflation. So what's the distinction between drift and conflation?
Inflation is what most people call hallucinations. And it's an immediate collapse of the distinction, say, between LASIK and RLE. So the language blends, it starts sounding maybe like persuasion. Maybe the education starts sounding pitchy or salesy. And it's beginning to smooth out some distinctions that probably should be sharp and stay sharp.
Okay, so again, because it's just using probabilities of how words are associated, it doesn't really know those distinctions. And over time, it's smoothing those out.
The word hallucination is everywhere now. Many
Yes.
people have read it and heard of it, but
Yeah.
this thing is a very polite toaster. Okay, it's just an algorithm, so they don't hallucinate. That's why they conflate. They confuse things that are simple for us to see that they aren't together. They aren't linked in any way. So this is the takeaway from the quote hallucination part. You've been, where'd you come up with that? I mean, like, you've lost your mind.
Yeah, I think we sometimes give these machines some human traits and they're just trying to do their thing. All right. So, another important factor with content production is the data that it's actually using. And so, in general, when people are using these LLMs, they'll say our model is using data through 2023 or 2024. But how is that misleading with medical information?
Well, any niche topic in ophthalmology, I mean, remember LLMs, large language models that the AIs run against for their training data, they're trying to index the world. They're trying to get lots of data sets. And the ophthalmology data set and the comparison of things they could be indexing and working with is not that big. So it's not the most current training data for a niche topic. So that topic, our topics, are probably closer to 2020 training data. And Peter, there's a lot that has changed in ophthalmology
Oh, yeah.
in 6 years.
For sure. So the takeaway here is that the date that you see when they're talking about training sets, that does not necessarily apply to your specialty. So it's important to keep that in mind. All right. So we're talking about training. There's another concept that talks about retrieval, training data versus retrieval. So explain a little bit more about what's involved there.
Yeah, retrieval is telling the chat bot to only retrieve from URLs that you give it. Now, it won't always follow instructions, but training data is sort of the soup that it goes in and plucks out what it needs to formulate a reply to your prompt. So it's not going to known websites and getting their latest data like AAO.org, iSmart, looking up what AAO says about glaucoma or whatever. It's going to the training data about glaucoma. But if you focus on it retrieving from a specified URL or two, then it's likely that you can at least limit the risk of it going to its own aged and rather suspect at times, I guess. That's probably a little harsh because it does return good info, but you just can't let it roll with exactly what it gave you without some process after it spits it out. So the retrieval of information means that it's going to a current website, which will have data or info in this case that's better, I think, than just
So
letting it return to the archives of its own training data.
So it's a way to mitigate the risks of it using information that could be inaccurate.
Well, it's anchored to something that's more current
Okay.
and less suspect if we can get it to be anchored to that, yes.
Okay. But someone may say, listen, this sounds like a lot to do. We have a doctor that is willing to kind of review this when it's output and make edits. So why do we need to bother with all these things? Why can't we just do our workflow? It's quick and cheap and easy. And then we have somebody review it. Why can't we just review it and be done with it?
Well, you certainly can, but the idea is could you nip it in the bud, so to speak, with the origination problem that you've got with the copy that it presents? So, could you restrict it in some way? Could you give it better instruction sets before it gives you the copy that you seek that then gets reviewed? Because it might be that that's a step where the copy is more trustworthy in general, whereas review is active and solving the origination or addressing the origination risks is proactive. That's really kind of the point I'm hoping you and I can get across here.
Okay, so being more proactive, so having more structure, and that brings us back to the concept of rigor. So let's dig a little deeper into that. Rigor as prevention, being more
Yeah,
proactive.
it's really about in programming, you've all heard the meme garbage in, garbage out. Well, it's not quite that bad about this. It's not garbage that comes out. It's true but misleading statements. It's probably the better way to say it. So rigor is where you enforce some conditions that might prevent errors from emerging as much as possible. So it doesn't make it smarter in the sense that the answer is sharper. It makes it less likely to suffer from some of these things we've been talking about, which is old training data or conflation. And then, of course, as the conversation itself lengthens, it gets suspect with drift.
Okay. So rigor, we're not saying that this is going to make AI smarter, but it may make it safer, at least in the context of what we're talking about here. So using your background in software, walk us through what structure you would recommend, without getting too technical for us doctors, but what would you recommend?
This is just a way of thinking about things right now. Think of it as a waterfall of steps that because you want AI in the beginning to be a thinking partner, at least I would want it to help me dial in my message, and make a compelling call to action and wrap some of the patient education pieces in something that moves the needle for a patient to either trust you or click to call or something that matters. You're producing this for a reason. So let's let it help you with the ideation and messaging and strategy or the campaign you have in mind. And that's the part where you don't want rigor. You want it to give you feedback and you build off each other until you get that message and that piece of copy that you think really matters and it's said well enough. So that becomes the beginning of the next step, which is a document that is used going forward in the form of something called a master control document.
So why don't you walk us through the structure that you mentioned without getting too technical?
Sure. It's basically 4 steps of think of it like a waterfall where the previous step helps the next step downstream. Begin with something called like brainstorming or message dialing in your message. It's ideation where AI doesn't have any really rigor at all. It's helping you think through how you want to do a typewrite message, maybe test some call to action ideas and promotional ideas, even. So it's where you think through with AI as a thinking partner about the campaign. Then once you like where you're at, you have it create what I'm calling a master patient education document for this campaign. Think of it as a doc file. It's still not anything that we're going to render copy with yet, but it locks down everything that the copywriting should include when it begins doing work for you. So it's something where the surgeons or whoever's looking at it for medical accuracy would look at it, and then that would be the master control document for this campaign copy. So that's also something that's generative, but it's the final version of the truth. Then we move into something that's like a validation layer where using more machine type language called JSON or JSON, it generates a JSON file, one file in this particular way of writing. It's pretty readable, like HTML is sometimes readable in that sense. So it's not like pure code and digits and binary anything. But it is a structured instruction set for AI to return to as it is using locked in facts and boundaries and things that you want to make sure it doesn't go off the reservation about as much as possible. Now, again, AI is going to be AI, but this structure is the better way than trying to engineer a super long and detailed kind of prompt thing. So it is a prompt, but it's not written in natural language per se.
So it's written in language that it can understand.
Yeah, it's more understandable and it's more rigid than just talking to it and having it give you back its best effort. So this is what's called the validation layer, and it's persistent then. It's used by each of the output types or work products that AI is going to generate for you based on the channel that this marketing copy is going to be put into. For example, ad copy, or let's say Google Ads. Now, example here is Google Ads have some rules about how long the subject line can be, how many characters, things like that. So each channel that you're going to run the campaign in has to have its own channel copy output. And so the adaptation is where you add those pieces in another JSON file is probably the easiest way, because once you have the add copy channel instruction, every time you want to use that channel, you just run it against the validation layer for that campaign.
Otherwise,
So,
you're looking at a lot of manual work, which defeats the whole purpose of using the AI in the first place.
and you have to keep checking its homework each
Yeah.
time you do one. So what looked good back in ideation and then became the Google Doc version of the campaign for it to draw from, if you just keep going back to it and don't put rigor in the form of a JSON file that is locked in for when it renders channel specific copywriting, then that rigor is gone. And then the channel itself has rules and regulations that optimize the copy for that channel. So it's JSON one is the thing that the channels keep pointing back to that isn't a doc file, isn't a Google Doc or a Word file. And each channel has its own recipe. So if you write it once, you reuse it many. You don't do this every time you do a campaign. You do
Okay.
the ideation, which generates the control document for patient education for this campaign, which then is the JSON that takes that and makes it something that AI can use when it's asked to build each channel copy that you want to run in your campaign.
So having this kind of structure then prevents issues from, again, retrieving inaccurate information, and decreases the chance that you're going to have to redo something. You never want to have AI deciding what patients are taught from a patient education perspective.
You don't prevent it entirely because AI is still going to try and go
It's going
out
to
there.
try.
Okay.
Okay.
So what you're trying to do is limit the amount of deep dive homework grading that you're forced to do. And you can have some confidence that it's true to the surgeon's version of the truth that they approve.
Okay. That's good. All right. So wrapping up here, what would be really the main takeaways from this topic that we covered today?
I think that the idea that AI is responsible for what goes out in terms of the final work product means that it shouldn't be responsible for that. That the rigor that you give it when it creates or responds to the request for copy is where you have the responsibility for trying to build a systematic way so that patient education in particular, and remember, we're not talking about brand identity development or research for competitors or things like that. This is a very specific work product that is necessary for it to be as bulletproof as possible to keep AI from succumbing. So if you can't explain who's the author, whether it's AI and you used it directly and you know that, or whether it's an agency who may or may not have used AI, or a freelancer for an agency, or yourself, which may or may not have used AI, then you're skating on thinner and thinner ice if you don't know who authored this truth, so to speak, what the sources were. So, for example, let's say you give it a list of approved sites, and it's AAO.org, iSmart, and NIH, and CRS Today, and whatever. If you simply tell AI, well, use these, but if you cite anything or if you use any source, you have to tell me the URL and the page that you got it from. Then at least you can visually look and see what it went out and got. And the ones that weren't on your approved list, then you don't use that copy, that section of the copy, or you rewrite it, tell it to go to the approved list for this. So you can't necessarily keep it from going or trying to go out, but you can grade its homework for where it got the stuff. And that's what I meant by what sources were used. And then if there's any way that you have for coming up with a plan to reduce the drift, let's say you don't talk to it for 10 minutes back and forth because that gets a really long conversation. And when you have a long exchange back and forth, you get drift in conflation or hallucination. So instead, maybe find a stopping point and you say, look, we're getting long and give me a prompt that I can take to a new chat because you're starting to drift and I'm worried about your answers being valid. So I'm going to start a new conversation and give me the prompt I need to continue this so that we can start afresh, but not start over. And that way you'll take that cheat prompt, open a new chat, and now the drift meter, for lack of a better word, has been reset. You've level set the beginning of your conversation again.
That's a good trick.
Well, rigor isn't just about controlling things, it's about responsibility and accountability. And so I'm going to refer back to the due diligence document that we will make available to you in the description to quiz whoever you're working with about their use of AI, just so that you have a sense of what their process is. Because right now you don't know their process, and maybe their process isn't rigorous at all, and they never do it the same way twice. So that's one of the things I will leave you with. Then the second one is it always sounds good. AI always sounds pretty good. And especially if you use like Claude, who writes better than the others. So knowing its limitations arms you for more managerial and governance type issues. And that's always your job anyway, is to not just try to get the most volume of content out there, but working within the risks of creating content with AI when it's patient education.
All right, great. So, yeah, to summarize, AI often produces great sounding patient education, whether you, your agency, or somebody they hired has used it. But that's the rub, that's the danger. But knowing its limitations can reduce the risks that it creates. So, anyway, we hope this podcast has given you some insights. That's a wrap for episode 1, and thanks for listening.